Yeah.
Sure. I think this is something you see kind of across traditions in general, is when you get to the 19th century, late 19th, early 20th century, especially, you have a lot of challenges to what were the reformers saying versus what did the theologians come after them saying. So you do have the Calvin versus the Calvinist thesis, arising at that time, but you do have something very similar going on with Lutherans as well. And I think neo-orthodoxy plays a part in this as well. When you look at guys like Barth, who are largely drawing on the reformers, but with very different, I think, philosophical assumptions than the immediate post-Reformation thinkers. So I think there are a lot of figures kind of involved in that. But from a Lutheran approach, I could give you just a kind of a couple of the major heavy hitters to set the stage theologically in terms of what's going on. Kind of a first primary figure that's there is Albrecht Ritschl. And Ritschl is a very well-known name, kind of the second major figure of Protestant liberalism after Schleiermacher. And what differentiates Ritschl, I mean, there are many things that differentiate Ritschl, but in terms of Luther studies, is that he really focuses a lot on the figure of Martin Luther, more than someone like a Schleiermacher would. So he's trying to take the tenets of Protestant liberalism and his particular unique approach to it and saying that he's actually understanding Luther in some ways better than the post-Reformation Lutheran tradition. So this starts a process in Luther studies of trying to divorce Luther from the tradition that came after him, to say maybe the tradition that came after him really didn't understand Luther. And in particular, the argument is that there's a kind of reversion to scholasticism. So Luther is seen as kind of the arch anti-scholastic. And scholasticism was the cause of all ills in the Middle Ages. And Luther, kind of saved the church from that. So Ritschl is going to say that scholasticism departs from Luther. He's also going to have a huge critique of pietism as well, which he largely rejects precisely because of their emphasis on this idea of the mystical union. So he's rejecting kind of the two major movements in Lutheranism after Luther, which is both of those, the Lutheran orthodoxy and then Lutheran pietism. So from Ritschl, what ends up happening in a lot of, especially German theology, is the shifts within Lutheranism in terms of scholarship. And I think you just see this in terms of the number of publications. If you look at publications on the figure of Luther or Luther's idea of whatever it might be, and original systematic works on those particular doctrines, you begin to see that the publications start to shift away from the doctrine of the church to publication on, say, Luther's doctrine of the church. So Luther studies ends up taking over the field of systematics in a lot of ways. I really don't think it's unfair to say. So the question in so much scholarship now becomes, well, what did Luther say, instead of a constructive positive dogmatics? And I think what really ends up happening there is ultimately they are doing constructive dogmatics, but they're trying to place those ideas back in the mouth of Luther, because it becomes, I think, much more difficult to say you're being consistent with that tradition when you have the highly formulated views of someone like even a Melanchthon, or going further, a Chemnitz or Gerhard, or these others that have very clear doctrinal positions laid out in these large textbooks. It's not as easy to put your ideas in there. But there's a lot more ambiguity, I think, with Luther, and it's not so systematic. So it becomes a lot easier to kind of reinterpret Luther in light of what ends up being, I think, whatever kind of philosophical commitments or pre-commitments one might have when approaching those texts.